Kelli Koschmann, thank you so much for joining Jess and myself on the People Leader Accelerator podcast. Great to have you here from not very sunny, very snowy Chicago, I guess.
Thank you so much.
Kelli, you were part of the very first People Leader Accelerator cohort more than 5 years ago. You've gone on to chief people officer roles. You've been head of the function multiple times. And we actually went through the same graduate degree program once upon a time. Would love for you to introduce yourself a little bit more fully, though, to our listeners.
Thank you, Andrew and Jess, for having me. I think of you both as like mentors and inspirations in the field. So it's just such a delight to be here chatting with you today. So yeah, I am not an accidental HR person. I am the HR person who found love of this field in undergrad. So I was studying psychology, and while I found it interesting, I was like a little disillusioned by the many theories and lack of hard science. So I took some electives in the business school, and I had one called Human Resources Management. And I just thought the scope of what you get to do in HR was so vast and so interesting. I just fell in love hard and never looked back. So I've spent my entire career in the field, most recently as chief people officer, first at Sitter City and then at Showpad. Led global teams before that for 10 years at SRAM, which is a bicycle company here in Chicago. And then most recently, I started my own organization, coaching and consulting, and it's called Walking Home. So the premise here is that I think all organizations and people let things get in their way. You know, performance equals potential minus friction. So how do we get rid of that friction and move organizations and people from good to great? And so that's what I'm up to today.
What a perfect background of experience for our listeners to draw from. Enterprise company experience, you're an avid cyclist and you got to work for a company that, does that as their product. And then multiple chief people officer roles, including, you mentioned Showpad. I don't know if everybody knows, who they are and what they do. Would you mind giving the measurables of them? And one of the things I'm hoping to talk about is their global headquarters model that might be of interest to other listeners. So go ahead and share a little bit more.
Yeah, absolutely. Super interesting company. It was founded in Belgium. It's a sales enablement software as a service. And so when I joined, the company was around 80 million in revenue, around 400 employees. And, really the goal of my joining was to help scale more into the US. So really strong European presence, wanting to grow into the US. And we had, dual headquarters, one in Ghent, Belgium, and one in Chicago, Illinois. So it was a really unique setup and a lot of fun and a great team.
Can I ask, what was the philosophy of wanting to have dual headquarters? I have interesting experience in that when I was at Gusto, they had what we called dual headquarters as well, but it was within the US. So we had San Francisco and we had Denver. And so we were navigating these concepts. But I imagine when you do it across continents that it leads to so many more interesting things, which we will get into. But what was the driving force or reason why they were like, let's do dual headquarters instead of just naming one?
I think it was probably premeditated shift in power and presence. Ultimately, the company did shift a bit from the European presence and sort of center of power into the US. But I think also just market presence and timeliness, right? If you're trying to expand into a new geography internationally, you want, a strong leadership presence with a lot of senior leaders on the ground.
And very tactically for folks who are like, ooh, like senior leaders tactically on the ground, like which leaders were in the US and which leaders were in Ghent?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think that was a really dynamic situation. So when I joined, and I've had the pleasure of working for a number of founder-led organizations. So when I joined, the founders were still in seat. And pretty shortly after I joined, probably 6 months in, we had some leadership movement. Founders shifted into board roles, and we announced new CEO from within. And then we hired a number of executives, largely in sales and marketing in the US. It was a constant shift back and forth, depending on where the right talent was. But I think strategically, with intention to increase the presence in the US.
Yeah. So that makes sense of like, it was a go-to-market motion to expand into the US. And so then you would have your go-to-market leaders that were the main ones that were initially there. My brain is going into two spots because I really want to dive into what was different about the headquarters, but I also want to pull on the thread of like, your founders were moving into different roles. You were bringing in a lot of executives. Like, as the HR leader, what was your mindset and aim of like what you were striving for through that dynamic change that was happening as you were going through your experience at Showpad?
Yeah, it's like taking me back to that moment, Jess, when I first heard that news. And I think that's true for a lot of us as HR leaders, is we get to have our own private moment and then we show the brave face to the organization. I think the intention was just, as always with change, it's like, how do we shift into growth mindset and say, what's the opportunity in this? Because there's always opportunity. And so I think comm strategy, how do we stage information so folks have the right information at the right time without getting overwhelmed, and really focusing on the opportunity. And then, whenever you have a leadership change, it's like, how can we be extremely present as leaders, and how can we, just over communicate the why, what you can expect, by when, what don't we know yet, and when will you hear from us again? And I think that's kind of a good model for anytime you're dealing with dramatic change.
How much of a heads up did you have on this change happening? Like, how much were you brought into the fold versus like, I'm reacting to this information and needing to figure out how to put on the brave face and bring it back to the org as a united front of leadership?
I'm trying to remember accurately, maybe 2 to 3 weeks.
Oh,
I'm curious, like,
okay.
Do you think that's a lot or a little?
It's something.
It's something. Yeah, it's more than some
Right.
people get.
Yeah.
It's got to be a particularly challenging and maybe somewhat unique situation in a venture-backed organization to have founding team transitions. I guess that only happens once at any org. I do a lot of private equity work, and I just see it all the time where the founding team is either raising their hand and saying, we signed up for this transaction with a new capital sponsor, and as part of that, we're going to move to a board role out of an operating role. And that's, I think, more known and more intentional and more planful, and you're kind of signing up for that often, moving to PE, unless you make an explicit agreement otherwise. But in venture-backed orgs, especially in explosive growth tech organizations, I feel like the default has been that the founding team hangs around kind of forever. I wonder how it transpired. And ultimately, if there's anything that our listeners could learn from through what happened there.
Yeah. And I'm just really searching for, how much do I know the full story such that I can pass along learnings. More so where I may add value to the listeners is just, there's naturally, in this case, a lot of fear in the organization and a lot of uncertainty, especially in this case, the founder was a very charismatic and well-liked, beloved leader who led with so much authenticity and heart and carried those values forward that really shakes the organization. And at the same time, we were embarking on a strategic initiative to really shift our culture. So we have founders stepping out, new leaders stepping in, and we're saying, oh, and by the way, we're changing our values. So many times in the HR leadership role, we know we're doing the right thing strategically and for the business. And we know that it's going to cause some pain in the short term. And so that was all, what we went through at Showpad. And really, I think some of the strategies to help the team through that are getting their perspective. So asking for help along the way from both formal leaders and sort of those well-respected leaders that, maybe don't hold the title, and letting them architect the journey of change with us. That's one big takeaway that's really helpful.
Yeah, if we were to get tactical about the cultural shift, what were the steps to actually figure out what are our new values and how do we put this into this organization?
Showpad, like many organizations in the time of COVID, which is when I joined, indexed very high on sort of this familial, high care, high empathy culture. And so what we needed to do was sort of build a little bit more of a high performance orientation on top of a caring and very human culture. And so we sort of knew at a high level that's what we needed to do, but we wanted to bring the organization along on the journey. And so we engaged, focus groups of leaders across all geographies, across all functions, again, to have that representative view to help us hone in on sort of what do we need to hold on to forever as the core of the culture and the fabric of who we are, and what can we maybe experience a little bit of pain, but let go of and move into a new way forward. And so we leveraged those focus groups, came up with a list of the new values. And so we did a lot of deeper work around bringing those to life. We actually created behavioral blueprints across 3 levels of leadership: leading self, leading others, and leading the organization, to really bring to life a playbook for how do we hire, how do we coach? How do we promote and really empower managers with what does, great look like in this new realm of values, which weren't all new, right? I think we had 2 or 3 new values, and then we just kind of made more explicit what we meant by those existing values.
And who was part of the main decision factors? Is that HR? Is that you plus the new leadership team? How broad was that leadership that was involved with this?
Yeah, that's a good question. Some things that will never leave me from PLA are a good stakeholder map. So before any initiative, figure out who are the players that are important in this and what role is each playing, and that HR should never build on an island. With those principles in mind, when I say we, there's a project charter for this initiative that includes a mix of executive sponsors, leaders, and other individuals who were playing an important role in the project. It's interesting when you think about we in the context of dual headquarters and culture, because, that is one of the most interesting and challenging things, is understanding national culture differences and making it all work as an executive team.
Can you share more about what were some of those national culture differences between Belgium and the US?
So we, trying to get everyone on the same page. As an executive team, we read The Culture Map by Erin Myers. So we actually brought Erin in to do some leadership training. One of the interesting differences is high context and low context cultures, and also decision-making scale of democracy versus, directiveness. But the US tends to be more up-down leadership decisive, and Belgium tends to be more let's drive consensus and let's take a ton of time up front, and then we're going to have a very speedy execution and tail of this decision, right? And so there's a lot of tension in those 2 approaches. And so we really had to figure out, first, develop the awareness as an executive team that, hey, maybe we're not making decisions as quickly as we should or as efficiently as we should. And then from that sort of awareness, moving into, okay, well, what are we going to do about it? Who adapts to whom is always the question when navigating different cultures. And how do we pave the way forward? And one of the tools that I learned about, the stayed decision-making tool, where you're just being very explicit about what are we trying to solve, who plays what role in the decision, what are the options we're considering, what data have we collected, and then what's our recommended path forward. And this is a really great tool for, pretty heavy, complex decisions. It's too time intensive for everyday decisions. But what that tool does is it allows for a very fruitful executive team discussion and ultimately an outcome to be made, where you also are documenting how you got there. And then you can revisit and look back at that and evaluate, how have we done? So these 6 decisions we've made this past quarter that were highly complex, how's it played out?
One of my go-to tools, the RACI, role clarity and decision-making clarity tool, which is also known as a DACI or a RASCI or an ARCI. And it sounds like it sprung out of Square.
Yes. It's kind of like a variation of a RACI, right?
Yeah. The root there, I think, is super valid around how does work get done? And the clearer you can be about that, the more likely it is that your organization is effective and efficient.
Exactly.
It actually sounds like it might be a little little complicated. Was it too complicated for an org that size, stage, maturity level of a Showpad, or was that a good fit?
I would say, again, if you're using it for very complex cross-functional decisions, it's a great fit. The cost of an executive team meeting, for example, is very high. You want everyone starting on the same page and having, any questions or new inputs that sort of expand that SPADE initial document so that you can quickly get to a decision. And again, then you can look back on it post-mortem. How are we doing with decision making?
I have to wonder if culturally it was a good fit too, because you had that Belgium influence of like, we do want to spend more time up front thinking through it and being more thorough. And then because we've been so thorough with this SPADE, then we can move fast. And so I think there's also a cultural match there unknowingly around like it was a deeper decision. And we also have a good cultural fit with these leaders who want to spend the time there.
Yeah, I think that's a great insight, Jess. Absolutely. That high context, high need for consensus. Okay, we've all kind of contributed to this. Now we can go.
I feel like this is worth calling out for the audience that I think is most interesting and potentially most useful for the listeners is that this cultural work wasn't done because it's the right thing to do, air quotes. It was done because the organization wanted to achieve something specific. It wanted to make decisions faster. It wanted to execute faster as it moved into the US market. And the consensus-driven culture in Ghent was useful historically, but there was a shift desired. And so you connected that cultural work to this role clarity and decision-making work, and you played the role of an internal management consultant, helping your organization to be more effective. Yes, we want people to be happy in their jobs. Yes, we want to be a great place to work. Stop me if I take this too far. I would argue that that would be an outgrowth of the core work of what we hopefully are doing in human resources in helping our organizations to meet their goals. So I applaud you for making those connections and stepping through the process to create value at your org. Nice work.
Thank you.
I'd love to dive further into this cross-cultural element and the fact that you did have a leadership team that was split across geographies. I think many of us in people leader roles have varying versions of, oh my gosh, like there's different viewpoints or people are in different places. What were some of the, whether they're cadences or norms or practices that helped to keep your leadership team more cohesive?
It's one of the things that I have done a 180 on is geographic strategy, being in person or being remote. And I think when dollars are there, we always have budget constraints, but if we can make an investment in getting together in person, I think that pays dividends down the road. And so I think that's something that we had a regular practice around of getting together in person on a quarterly basis. And we made investments to get regional teams together as well. And that's a big investment. I can remember coming out of COVID, we made a huge investment to bring all of EMEA together in Ghent and the US together in Chicago. And a big part of that was simply connection and team building. It wasn't all focused around like team strategy, planning, et cetera. The highlight of that was sheep herding as a team building activity in Belgium. That was like top team building I've ever experienced. We're literally running around in a field with guidance from sheep herders to corral these sheep. There were so many leadership lessons that played out. You had like the leaders who were just trying to force the sheep, physically running like madmen. The other leaders who were like planning strategically, like watching what's going on. And then like, okay, here's what we need to do collectively to make this happen. I mean, it was hilarious. And so much wisdom flowed from that. So look, there's no replacement for getting together in person and breaking bread and doing silly things together. Rituals are so incredibly important for distributed teams, whether they're globally distributed or nationally distributed. And so both the founder and the new CEO that replaced the founder were really tuned into this, right? So always showing up, always holding, regular all hands fireside chats, ask me anythings, thinking about new ways to communicate in ways that would reach people. I think that what we face today as a society is just this overwhelm of information and talent is depleted. And so we need to find creative ways to ensure that people are aligned. They know where we're heading. They know what our corporate strategy is. They know the role they play. And they're, feeling like we're celebrating and making progress with small wins and recognizing people along the way. And so one of the things that I think is incredibly important is flattening communication. We relied a lot on people leaders to do all of the cascading. And I think that's one thing that I've learned along the journey is that is a neat expectation. Every leader will give the right flavor to their teams. And then what happens often is that those leaders are so busy surviving the day, they don't always get it done, right? And so then you have pockets in the organization that are blind to what's happening. And so I really love the strategy of flattening communication and ensuring that communication is flowing from leadership, and we're creating enablement for managers to do it as well. And that's our safety net. We know it's happening, and that repetition is incredibly important in this org overwhelm that everyone is facing right now.
We would love for cascading communication to work, and lots of organizations have lots of layers. And isn't it just precious that we hope and expect that will happen, but going direct is probably necessary on a lot of things. Managers can support it, managers can reinforce it, but if we count on all the various managers in all the various places doing all the various things to cascade the message, chances are it's going to be spotty. That's a really powerful insight and kindly put by you.
Love it. It's also a bit of, how much telephone do you want to be playing within your organization? And so I think there is power in leaders having their own flavor and their own interpretation. But I think in addition to hearing it directly from the CEO or directly from whomever is the leader that's most impactful or behind it, as opposed to, and I think this is absolutely right, kind of this wishful thinking that many organizations have is like, we talked about it in our exec meeting and you all go figure out and filter whatever you think is the thing that you think your people may or may not need to know. And to your point, like leaders are busy. It is not the most important thing for them to sit there and filter exactly what their teams need to and don't need to know. I think it is ideal, but it doesn't always happen, especially in these organizations that are moving fast and growing quickly. And, there's so many other things on the plate.
I'm wondering if there's a rule of thumb or some boundary conditions around this, because I've argued the other side of this as well, where I've encouraged founders and leadership teams at orgs that have grown quickly. They're used to doing all hands every week and communicating everything to everybody directly and skipping department heads. Just the department head has no role. And I've encouraged them to make sure that there is a role for managers and department heads and that they're informed of something important in advance before their teams hear it so that they can be supportive. So I can take either side of this, but is there actually a helpful rule of thumb or framework that our listeners could apply to when do you go direct with all hands versus when do you go through managers to cascade it? I'm putting you on the spot. Do you have any perspective?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's a both and, right? I really align with what Jess shared, that it's you want both the centralized communication going direct and leaders putting their own flavor on. And I think it's also when you're going direct, you have preceded that with the leadership team. They're not receiving it at the same time. They've already had time to digest it and prepare their, flavor and how they're going to pass this along to their team. So I think it's a both and for sure.
I love this proposition, though, that you're putting forth, Andrew. I think my initial reaction is that they're not in conflict in my mind of in and all hands. Yeah, we don't always need to hear from the CEO. We should mix it up. We should have other speakers who are sharing to the organization, but maybe it's a 1-2 full organization type of communication. So there's consistency in what's coming forth. But I love what Kelli's encouraging as well is we need leaders who hear these messages ahead of time so that they can anticipate what are the questions that I think are specifically going to come from my team members and how do I respond to that? And if I'm hearing that at the exact same time as everybody else, I don't get the benefit of being able to process that and think through some of these additional elements. to kind of build on this idea of when to be consistent and when to kind of be more specific, how do you think about from an HR standpoint, especially global organization, lots of different approaches potentially that are cropping up, especially as the organization's growing. But how do you think about consistency versus local autonomy when it comes to, values, interpretations of those values or norms or people practices?
Yeah, I think very simply, it's aim for global consistency unless there's a local market reason to depart from that. So for key business processes, for efficiency, I'm going to want to encourage the same process, the same, smart, efficient process globally. But if there's a local market consideration for why that should differ, absolutely, we assess that, embrace it, and then roll forward with what makes most sense locally.
Once upon a time, I worked at a company that at the time was known as Diamond Foods. We were buying the Pringles brand from Procter & Gamble, which is, if you can imagine Pringles, shelf stable. It exists everywhere in the world. And so we were in the process of acquiring this business that had people in 40-something countries that all had different market practices, different management practices, different compensation practices. And we didn't really try to keep much the same other than company level goals, leadership team cadence. We had top of the house values consistent. But boy, if somebody had a car allowance in the country of Panama, we didn't think twice about what France required with health and welfare and required retirement savings. Like that's just what was required in those geographies. So it's interesting that there are smaller businesses now that are wrestling with these global issues that big businesses have wrestled with for a long time and have largely resolved, where you make those decisions when you're global and you just, get through it and then you replicate. With technology and remote work and distributed work the way it is now, it seems like there are just a lot more companies at much earlier stages that are wrestling with these complex issues sooner.
There's always an acquisition strategy, right? Are we going to allow, the acquired companies to continue operating and centralize what we can? I think in the case of like our SaaS business at Showpad, certainly from a total rewards perspective, it's interesting. And I think the anchor for us is we want to pay competitive to market at this percentage. And the mix underneath that's going to be wildly different in each country because of local norms and practice. But it did still create a bit of perception of inequity. So if we're communicating about something at the company level and, a certain portion of the organization it's not relevant to, they're like, well, why don't we have that, right? And so there's just a huge education and communication component. And then that's why I think it's really important to foster a culture where that unrest gets unearthed, gets shared so that we can shine the light on it, explain and tell the story and move forward. Because if those things bubble and simmer underneath, they create some toxicity that makes collaboration harder.
What were some of the avenues that you leveraged to be able to unearth these questions or unrest?
It's so funny. This was a time when I think we're still there, where trust between employees and employers is very low. And so we launched a question box and we had a tremendous amount of debate around this being anonymous. Could you submit a question anonymously or did you need a name attached? And we started with anonymous questions with good intention, but we found that, it was an opportunity for people to not ask a question, but sort of share some trolly feedback. And so we sort of addressed that head on and said, you know what, this is not being used in the intended way. So we're shifting our practice here. We're all leaders in the organization. We invite legitimate questions and or feedback to be shared, but we need to know who it's coming from so we can contextualize it. And I think that helped have much more productive sessions when we did the question answering as an executive team or a leadership team. But it was an interesting tension. And I saw a lot of organizations wrestling with that, anonymous versus out in the open. Yeah.
Yeah. And was this a physical question box in the office or was this a digital question box?
A digital submit a question for all hands.
Got it. Yeah. I know so many organizations that have wrestled with it. And one of the things that I wonder is if it's helpful to have both avenues exist of like some forms that are fully much, my name is attached to it. You know, it's coming from over here, this department, this tenured employee, and other versions that are an outlet for some of the snarky feedback that maybe we wouldn't hear otherwise. But to unearth it, we kind of need to have a little bit of a opening for it to come through.
Yeah. Again, it's always a both and, right? So, I mean, we had those anonymous avenues certainly in our engagement and inclusion surveys. And those are hard to work with because, again, it's very rare that you get feedback or a question that sort of contextualizes it enough for action. And so therein lies the challenge. Like you want to go back to the individual and sort of say, help me understand, what did you mean by this? Or in what circumstance this? Otherwise, it's kind of hard to action. The worst thing we can do is seek input and then not action it. And that's the problem I see with anonymous engagement surveys.
The both and works as long as we don't end up overcomplicating and saying like, slap on the wrist, you went through the wrong channel to share this piece of feedback. Especially if you're at a smaller organization that's trying to keep things simple, that's where judgment comes in from the HR leader and from the leadership team around what actually works for us, what's good enough to get to the goal that we want to get to along the way. And your judgment, having been through this story a few times, is well honed along the way. Actually, I'd love to, follow up with that. Thinking about like your judgment is honed, is grounded in these multiple experiences working in global organizations. And maybe this plays into some of the, tell me if it does or doesn't, plays into some of the coaching work that you're doing today with Walking Palm, your leadership coaching practice. How have you gone about helping leaders to have a more global perspective if they don't have the same level of global operating experience that you do? Is that a common issue that leaders face, or is that just truly a one-off?
I think as a coach, our job for the ICF is to ask more questions than to guide or tell. But I think the value we can provide and where that honed experience can add value is in the clarity of distance. So working with a coach, it's different than a trusted friend or colleague or partner because we're not in it with you. We have this like very unique perspective. We're not in the box. We're not in the drama. So we can see a different picture and ask a question that might help that person hone their own perspective in the moment in that situation or move through where they're stuck. I remember I found coaching very early on in my career. I was working in a male-dominated industry, and I would get viscerally activated by what I perceived as poor leadership or being wronged in the workplace. And I was so fortunate to be paired up with a coach early on in my career who taught me some strategies to move through that. And I think that's the value we can provide as coaches, is just helping people move through the very real experiences they have at work where they can get stuck, and there's no reason to stay there. But humans, we do that. We get stuck. We have patterns and beliefs that keep us there. So that's where I think the honed experience plays a part rather than being more directive and telling people what they need to do.
You're a real coach. I went through coaching certification, but the work that I do one-on-one with HR leaders, I frame it more as mentoring. You're going to work with me if you actually want my experience and want my perspective and want my opinion. Even though I'm not doing the job, I've done similar jobs. It's a subtle but important difference where a coach, as you said, Kelli, and Jess, I'm interested in how you draw the line as well. The coach asks deep, revealing questions without guiding, I think.
If you've ever been a true consultant who's constantly giving answers, becoming a coach is actually very hard because you're like, I know an answer that they could use right now, but instead I'm going to coach them through this moment and have them get to their own solution. And in my practice, I blend the two. And there's certain things where it's like, if they are trying to figure out what's the best ATS to scale their recruiting, like that's an advising moment. But if they're like, hey, should I hire this person or not? That for me is a true coaching moment because I'm not going to make the decision on the hire. But I do think that they probably have some really good insight with good coaching questions that will surface what they're truly thinking is the right answer for them and their organization.
Yeah. And I think mentorship and advising are so important. And I know I have found value from both of you in, serving those roles for me along my career. And so I think bottom line is it's really important to learn to ask for help as a leader. And that is a skill. And I think a lot of leaders don't get that. They shoulder a lot of burden because they feel like, okay, I need to have all the answers. Everyone's looking at me. And that is just like a shortcut to burnout. So being a leader who knows how to build a bench of like advisors inside and outside the organization and folks they can ask for help, maybe throw in a few coaches and mentors as well. And that's the recipe for success, I think.
So insightful. And I think if folks listening haven't yet learned how to build their bench of advisors and mentors and folks outside the organization, like now is a great time to start. Oftentimes, as an executive, we're looking initially towards our boss to provide some of that and then realizing, oh, wait, CEOs don't really do that in the same way that like a chief people officer would do for you when you're growing up in the HR organization. And so it has to come from outside. I wonder if we might move to a few other questions. We lovingly call this our accelerator round. One of the first questions is PLA loves high leverage learning. If you could recommend 2 resources, whether people or books or newsletters that you're following to someone who's emerging as a people leader, what 2 sources would make the cut?
So I think Charter is a publication that I love to follow. They have really thoughtful data-backed resources, case studies, et cetera. So Charter would be number 1. There is a book that I have on my desk. It's called The Microstress Effect: How Little Things Pile Up and Create Big Problems and What to Do About It by Rob Cross and Karen Dillon. So I think that's a really relevant one back to that point where we're talking about being depleted as talent. And there's a lot of lovely lessons about leading in the book, as well as how to gain more perspective so you don't burn out.
I'll jump in, Kelli, with another question, maybe not part of our traditional accelerator round. Could you talk about the brick for us?
Oh, yeah.
What is the brick and why do you use it?
A lot of what I have been trying to do the last couple of years is tune inward a little bit more for creativity and intuitive ideation. So the brick is a physical device that you can tap with your phone to make certain apps inaccessible. And so this helps me break my phone addiction. And nothing else I've tried, whether it's going grayscale or anything, has worked. But my husband gave me this gift and I have been off Facebook and Instagram on my phone for, I think, 2 months now.
Wow. So that's a great way to stay centered and stay present. Maybe one more. You have a mantra or a worldview that I thought was interesting from your coaching practice. Do you mind sharing with our audience?
Yeah, something that really struck me in my coach training was this principle that everyone's doing the best they can with what they have at the time. But what it means is just like, it really comes into play with decision making. So not to overthink decisions, like with what you have right now, what's the best decision for you, right? And move forward. So I think that's a really great way to bring empathy to any person or situation.
I love that. Along the lines of mantras or pieces of advice, what's a sentence of advice that you would share about how to accelerate a successful HR career? And I love that your background comes from the beginning, knowing, in college, like HR is for me. What would you share with our listeners who are trying to figure out, how do I move up, whether it's a ladder or get more experience, but how do I get ahead in this HR career right now?
So I think formerly in my career, I was like, how do I build the best in class HR department and have the best systems and the best teams and execute our roadmap? And I think something I really took to heart from PLA was, that's not your job, right? Your job is to serve your stakeholders and create value and impact. And so if you're not building your roadmap with that at the forefront, you're not going to win. And so I think that's a tough lesson to learn. And I think it applies to every function. I work with a lot of leaders who are doing this optimization for function. And at the executive level, you really got to be thinking about the system. And so if you're optimizing for your function, you're inherently not optimizing for the system. So I really think that it is essential to understand the business, where you're going, what market impact you're trying to have, and then do the tough work to figure out, okay, what are the few initiatives we can do from a talent perspective that are going to impact that market goal. So that's the number one piece of advice. I think there are so many folks that got into HR because they're people, and I think they're suffering because you're a business leader.
So well said. For those in our audience who would like to connect with you, what's the best way that they can find you?
Yeah, well, they can find me on LinkedIn, Kelli Koschmann, or my company website is walkingpalm.co.
Great. Kelli, thank you again. We appreciate you. I refer you regularly. I don't know if you know this, but like I'm constantly using your name. People that are reaching out to me for coaching and support. And I say, I'm a mentor. Kelli's a coach. You should talk with her. Wisdom aplenty in this discussion. Thank you for sharing real life examples and the complexity that happens in a global environment. And your perspective is just so wise. And, Kelli, thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure.